first session, we looked at the Paul and the Damascus Road. In our second session, we looked at a bit of Paul and some of the letters he wrote, Paul the theologian, we might say. Last time, we looked at a little bit more about what Paul might have said or not said about Jesus. Tonight, we're going to take the easy options. We've done the difficult ones, and we're going to have a nice, easy, kind of cosy chat. Not going anywhere near controversial topics. No, not sorry. We're going to look at two. Well, Ben asked me to look at some kind of contemporary issues, some contemporary ways of kind of that Paul might have ramification or might have use. So I picked two particular themes. First, we're going to look at Paul in terms of the gender question, particularly what Paul says or doesn't say about women. So that's nice and straightforward. And then we'll take another deep breath and we'll ponder what Paul says or doesn't say about same-sex relationships. Two issues which have divided the church through the generations. I can't promise we will solve all of them tonight, but hopefully we will have a chance to say something about it. But before we get into the text, I wonder if we might just start with a few principles, or a few kind of starting points. I thought it would be helpful if I could just name where I'm coming from, so that I can name my own perspective. I come from the evangelical tradition, which at least historically has tried to take the scriptural text seriously as the rule for faith and life. And that tradition has kind of shaped me. And that means when I encounter the Pauline texts, and particularly those more difficult texts, I confess that my desire, my kind of go-to, I want to get Paul off the hook. I want to help Paul. I want to make it easy for Paul. That's my kind of prejudice, if I can use that term. So I want to kind of name that. That's where I'm kind of coming from. But hopefully it makes me more honest. If I'm kind of honest about where my prejudices are, and I can kind of deal with them more responsibly and with more integrity. So I want to name that from the outset. Secondly, I hope that tonight what we'll do is look at what Paul has to say on these two issues. What conclusions we might draw as to our own response in that light, I think, is a different question. They may be related, but I think it's a different question. We're going to try and just hear Paul on his terms. But thirdly, that's quite hard to do. I think particularly with the gender question, because so much of the discussion around the role of women within church, within ministry, has been shaped by readings of or misreadings of Paul. And it's hard to kind of set that tradition, set that history to one side. So I just kind of name that's the kind of context we're in. So fourthly, I invite you to ponder what, in inverted commas, what prejudices you bring to the text. And I hope that will enable you to engage with them in more honesty. And finally, I hope that what we're going to set forth is that there are a variety of ways of reading these texts. And I think I hope I've done my job if I can just say here are some of the ways in which they might be read. Not claiming that one is the right one and others are wrong, but we'll try and tease out a variety of options. So right from the outset, I'm sitting on the fence. Right up my bum, so to speak. Is that okay?
Yeah.
But Each of the sessions thus far, we began with a quotation from 2 Corinthians 5:16. From now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. I said from the outset that that was a really helpful text as a kind of overview of our lectures. I can't say that it's particularly pertinent for our discussion tonight, but having said it was pertinent, I just left it up there. So let's move on. And turn instead to begin this discussion around the gender question, and particularly the portrayal of women within the Pauline literature. What did Paul think about women? I think before we engage with that, we need to ask some questions. Firstly, what agenda do I bring to the Pauline text? Am I trying to get Paul off the hook? Or actually, is Paul guilty before I even get to reading the text? Is Paul irredeemable? And I'm sure even in this gathering tonight we would find a variety of pre-understandings of what Paul might be saying. A variety of agendas that we bring to the text. Do I want to redeem Paul? That's probably where I am, if I'm honest. Or do I want to condemn him? You just might want to ponder which side of the fence you're on. Secondly, is Paul consistent in his treatment of women? I hope if you picked up anything over the last 2 or 3 weeks, it is that Paul tends to not be consistent. Paul might say one thing to one church and something really quite different to another. You may remember that we said that Paul's very happy to take money from Philippi, who he gets on with very well, this kind of big loving that is the letters of the Philippians. To the Corinthians, at least in 1 Corinthians, the church that he's, it's a bit frosty, they don't really like each other very much. As soon as if you were to take money from Corinth, they start to pull the strings. So he won't take money from Corinth, but he will take money from Philippi. So he'll say different things to different churches. And I think that's particularly the case in some of his discussion around women and in relation to women. Friends, if we only Pauline text or 1 Corinthians, I suspect Paul would be regarded as the great oppressor of women rightly or wrongly. Conversely, if all we had was Paul's epistle to the Romans, if that was our only Pauline text, Paul would be seen as the great liberator of women. As you're going to see, the picture is very different from 1 Corinthians than it is in Romans. And trying to find some way of navigating that difference or handling that difference is central to the question. I don't think he is consistent. And thirdly, just bearing in what kind of difficulties emerge when trying to establish Paul's view on women. There's a number of list is fairly endless. How do we take account of the context to which the letters are written, a context which may be quite foreign to us? How are we trying to discern what's kind of going on in Corinth, or what's kind of going on in Rome, or what's kind of going on in Galatia? What is Paul responding to? We're always having a kind of second guessing about what's going on behind the scenes. Paul is a 1st century Jewish male, an unmarried male, at least unmarried when he writes his letters. That's likely going to in some way impact on his discussion of women. He writes as a male, we can't really get around that. He may have been married. some have suggested that because Paul is a Pharisee, he must have been married to have been a Pharisee. That was kind of the expectation that a Pharisee was married. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. It means taking some of what they call later rabbinic writing and bringing that back into the first century. Some later rules and bringing that back earlier. And I think if Paul were married, I don't think he would be able to move around with quite the ease that he does. And he just says, I'm not married. 1 Corinthians, he'll say that he's not married. So we're getting a now view whether we like it or not. Then just as a kind of heads up, that trying to find what are the contours of Paul's view on women is can be hard to map. Let me read the opening to you of the Epistle to Philemon, famously the shortest letter of Paul in the New Testament. When I teach a module on Paul, I ask the students so that they can focus on one letter throughout the module. I say they can't take Philemon, that's too easy an option. How does he begin? Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus and Timothy our brother, to Philemon, our dear friend, and our co-worker, to Apphia, our sister, and to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. Philemon is described as a dear friend, as a co-worker. Archippus is a fellow soldier in the faith on Samaris. But what about Apphia, our sister? We don't know much about Apphia other than this reference here, really. And it's easy perhaps to overlook her inclusion. But A, she's named as the recipient of the letter, which is not insignificant, I venture. She's described as a sister. And to the church in your house. Whose house? Philemon's? Archippus's? Or Apphia? It's not entirely clear. The your in Greek is singular, so it's one of them. And some commentators have suggested that often the normal practice is that it is the woman who is the householder, the one who kind of runs the house. And thus the language of to the church that runs in your house, that operates in a house, may suggest that rather than Philemon being the church leader, rather than Archippus being the church leader, that maybe Apphia is indeed the leader of the church that meets in her house.
Yeah.
I would have read it in that light. You just asked the question, which of the three was it? When I read that text, I immediately assumed Apphia would have been the hostess of the group, running the church, as they do today.
You can make a case for any of the three of them being there. Grammatically, you can make a case for any three. It could be Philemon, it could be Apphia, it could be Archippus. But at the very least, there's the option, there's the possibility that in here is kind of throwaway reference. It could be that Paul, supposedly the great repressor of women in active ministry, is just writing and affirming her leadership of a local church gathering. And that's just what it is. So whilst there are the more famous or infamous passages which we're going to look at shortly, even the more apparently nondescript ones may have something to say in this line. Let's first look at some what I call positive passages. This is me trying to redeem Paul, get Paul on side. This is Paul with a supposed first century alpha male. What language is he using in respect of his ministry? There's some rather interesting language that he chooses to use. Some of it is rather maternal. Mother Paul, rather than Father Paul, we might say. In 1 Thessalonians, as you said before, 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest Christian text, the first Pauline letter that we have available to us. He writes, we might have made demands as apostles of Christ, but we were gentle among you. We were gentle among you. Or maybe we became infants among you. The text kind of varied as opposed to which translation to go with, but the Greek words vary. I confess I gravitate towards the gentle, and the NRSV certainly goes with that arrangement. We were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her children. And it feels to me it's kind of wet nurse language. It's that language of feeding with milk. These are young babies being nourished with milk. And Paul appropriates that very maternal, feminine, if I can use that term, language and imagery, and this alpha male applies it to himself. Similarly to the Corinthian church, the church that he's wanting to tell off, get a bit shirty with. What does he say to them? I fed you with milk, not with solid food, because you weren't ready for solid food. Again, similarly appropriating this kind of maternal imagery, this kind of wet nurse imagery. Like strikingly so for someone who's often thought of as this alpha male, very, very strong male figure, appropriating very maternal imagery, particularly when dealing with his churches. Or to go back even earlier in the life cycle, what about this language we find in Galatians? Paul, an alpha male, a hard-speaking, very passionate first century Jewish male. My little children, for whom I am again in the pain of childbirth. Paul appropriates birth language and applies that to his relationship with his churches. And that's really quite striking. Now, there have been some interpreters who have found that problematic. There are some commentators have kind of objected to Paul appropriating maternal or birth imagery, saying that's not appropriate for a male to appropriate female language and in so doing. And one can hear that argument. That's not an unusual argument to make, but nonetheless, that's what he does. This more ostensibly female language of birth and motherhood is taken away by by Mother Paul rather than by Father Paul. Elsewhere there are some other what I might call palatable texts. Texts in which Paul seems to speak quite very positively about women. Perhaps one of the most famous Pauline texts, a kind of climactic moments towards the end of Galatians 3, where Paul says, "There is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male and female, for you are one in Christ Jesus." Many read this as saying there's no longer any hierarchy. Whereas in many ways in the first century Jewish world, there was a male hierarchy over women that Paul is said to abolish that. So many would read that quite positively. Equally, others are more cautious. There are some feminist commentators who have again objected to the way in which Paul eliminates gender by bringing it down into just one genderless context. So I think one can read 328 in either way. More significant to my mind, and this is where I think is the most positive text we find in terms of Paul's treatment of women, is Romans 16. And if all we had of Paul was Romans, or particularly Romans 16, he would be the great liberator of women. How's it begin? It's basically a hello from all of from all to all the people that I've been working with. How does it begin? I commend to you our sister Phoebe.
Deacon.
She's a deacon. Now, quite what we do with that word deacon, it's a contested term. In some church traditions, it's a more significant role. It's some form of ministerial role. In other ways of rendering it, it may be more of a servant in that role. It can be a slightly slippery term. But here, the fact that she's named at the outset seems to suggest that Phoebe is someone with clout, someone with influence. The fact that she's named needs to be commended. And it looks potentially that she may well be the letter carrier. That Paul has given a letter to Rome. She's the postie, so to speak. And we think that quite a lot of responsibility is put on the letter carrier, as the one who takes questions from the audience, who kind of represents the figure from whom it is sent. So the fact that she's mentioned first, that she's flagged as a deacon, and potentially portrayed as a letter category. And it's important to Paul that she's welcomed by the Romans, suggests that she is a woman of influence and significance. Help her in whatever she may require from you, for she's been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. That's quite a lot to say about Phoebe in terms of positive information about her. Who's next? Greet Prisca and Aquila. Greet Prisca and Aquila. You may remember that Prisca and Aquila are mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. She's known as Priscilla elsewhere, and we assume it's the same. She's mentioned in the book of Acts. Priscilla and Aquila emerge in Acts very much as on a level with Paul. Paul's kind of co-workers. They're on the same level. He rates them. mention that there is a significance of that it's Prisca and Aquila, and not Aquila and Prisca. And that the one who is in charge, so to speak, it goes first. Maybe, I think that's a nice idea. I'm not sure there's evidence of that, or evidence to support that. I think she's just named first of the pairing. It might be nice if it was an affirmation of authority. I'm just not sure there's evidence that we can prove that. But the Romans are to greet them. They worked with Paul and Christ Jesus. They risked their necks for his life. And we also the church in their house. Even if Prisca is not in some way above Aquila, they seem to be on the same level. The church is in their house. They seem to be kind of co-leading the church, female and male. Greet my beloved Epaphras, don't know much about him. And also greet Mary, who has worked very hard amongst you. Don't know much about that Mary. There's quite a few Marys in the New Testament. Seems to be a reasonably common name. But in those first 6 verses, we've got 1, 2, 3 women named who seem to be significant and well regarded by Paul, trusted with Paul, and who've been significant figures for him in helping him in his ministry. And into verse 7. Greet Andronicus and Julia, my relatives who are in prison with me. And the next sentence is the critical one. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. They are prominent among the apostles. That's the key phrase. That's the key phrase which is exercised commentators and translators over a number of years. Firstly, there's been debate about whether Junia is male or female. And for some time, Junia was regarded as a male figure, because it was assumed that if Junia was prominent among the apostles, and the apostles must all be men, therefore Junia must be male. That doesn't quite work, I'm afraid. A name that ends in A, particularly in Greek, would invariably be a female name. That would just be the norm. So most commentators, and vast majority would say, no, we concur. Actually, Junia is a woman, a female figure, whatever we say something about her. So I think she's female. However, the translation of the phrase in green on the screen, prominent among the apostles, has been the contested phrase. And this shows where our assumptions about what we think Paul should and might say reflects the conclusions we end up coming to about what we think Paul is saying. A number of translations will render that phrase as prominent among the apostles, as the NRSV does here. However, others have suggested that it could alternatively be rendered as Andronicus and Junia are well known to the apostles. blue rendering, she's an apostle. On the red rendering, she's a well-regarded figure, popular no doubt, but she's not an apostle. And you can trace the literature on the translation of this phrase, and invariably the translation that the commentator gives is dependent upon what they think the translation should be. And surprisingly, they find themselves agreeing with whatever view that they propose for it. I think in terms of the most recent Greek scholarship, this rendering has won the day. That the prominent, irrespective of the theological issues that arise from it, just on a lexical view, just on the translational view, prominent among the apostles is the most persuasive translation. And if it is the most likely, then let's have ramifications. Here, Paul is explicitly affirming female apostleship. And is affirming female apostleship potentially before he was an apostle. Initially, he says they were in Christ before I was, but one assumes some apostolic calling is being associated with being in Christ. And if you follow that line, it was just that from very early on, there were female apostles. And Paul was recognising that, is cognizant of that, and doesn't really comment much further on it. So in sum, in terms of particularly from the Romans 16 perspective, when we're trying to kind of get a makeup of Paul's attitude to women's involvement in ministry, what we might call Team Paul, there are a number of women who are rather prominent. Junia, Phoebe, Prisca, as we've seen, and Mary. But elsewhere across the Pauline literature, we see Chloe. We mentioned Chloe a couple of weeks back. Chloe crops up at the beginning of 1 Corinthians. Chloe's people feed back to Paul about what's happening in Corinth. If Chloe's got people, we assume she's a fairly influential businesswoman. She's got clout and influence. We suspect that she was some kind of patron for Paul. But patron doesn't quite work with the expression, quite a male term, patron. If I say she's a matron of Paul, that doesn't quite work either, does it? But Chloe seems to be a significant person in Team Paul. Lydia, who Paul encounters in Acts, the cloth dealer. Or, of course, Aphia, who we've just seen in Philemon, perhaps of Team Paul. Or even in Philippians, two women who seem to be in some form of significant role in the church in Philippi, Euodia and Syntyche, who seem to have crossed swords and have a bit of an argument amongst them, and Paul has to intervene. But the assumption is they're fairly influential people as part of the church life in Philippi. So in sum, there are a number of what I might call palatable texts in which Paul seems to have a very positive attitude towards women in ministry. Let's pause there, just for a minute or two, and just have a little conversation amongst yourselves. See if there's any kind of questions or comments that come out from it, just for a couple of minutes. And famously, perhaps most famously, the head covering discourse of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of the text, we might just pose the question, what is it about Corinth? Why, having seen some very positive language used in Romans, do we get this discourse that is, for many, highly problematic in Corinth? What is it about Corinth that's occasioned or contextualised Paul's response? What's amiss here? Is there something going on in Corinth of which Paul is aware of and of which the Corinthians are aware of, but we, the readers of these texts 2,000 odd years later, aren't aware of? Equally, is there something about the particularity of the Corinthian context? It's quite a religious city, plenty of temples. And it may be there are some issues around women in worship at those temples, which Paul is seeking to address, but about which we don't know the full details. When I'm teaching Corinthians, I tend to describe it. Anyone here from Milton Keynes? Good. Corinth is a bit like Milton Keynes, a bit nouveau riche, a bit kind of wanting to be on that, but still not got the class of a Wolverhampton. Is there something going on in Milton Keynes / Corinth that Paul is addressing? And which isn't saying, it's just that Paul isn't saying because they just know about it. And then we're just having to fill in the gaps. So we might say, even right at the outset, whether we're wanting to redeem Paul or to condemn Paul, I think being attentive to what's not said is perhaps as important about what is said. And what does he say? I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain traditions just as I handed them on to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It's one of the same things as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. My friend.
Surely it would have been normal for a Jew to cover their
Yeah.
to cover his hair in prayer.
The comment is it would be usual for a man to cover his head in prayer.
In Judaism.
In
Yes,
Judaism.
it is.
We're in Corinth.
Right.
And Corinth is Gentile territory. So from that immediately, it's a good question, it immediately reminds us to be attentive to the Corinthian correspondence and to what that might pertain to what Paul's prior experience is. It seems there's kind of, well, there's a number of questions that this passage raises, but we might draw attention to two in particular. Firstly, what does it mean by head? The Greek word is kephale, and kephale normally means head, what I've got on my neck. But that doesn't quite work, does it? So for many, headship here has been seen as a way of, or synonym for kind of some form of authority or oversight in that regard. And certainly the tradition has worked with that in some way, that the male is, or the man is the head of the wife. More recently, some commentators have said that kephale might be otherwise translated as source, S-O-U-R-C-E. I want you to understand that Christ is the source of every man, the husband is the source of his wife, and God is the head or the source of Christ. I mean, A, that's quite an unusual translation term, and B, I'm just not quite sure it helps us anyway. I'm not quite sure what sourceness kind of brings to the equation. It may be that the woman finds her origin in man in some form of interdependency, but I find it hard to get round the idea of headship just being about some form of authority, whether we like it or not. That seems to be what Paul's saying. What though about the head coverings? My friend has already observed that in a Jewish context it would be more likely for the male, for the man to be head covered, and for the woman to be not. And here's why I think being in Gentile Corinth makes a difference. On my reading it to me, it seems that Paul is making essentially a cultural argument. That if in your context, if in the Corinthian context, it's appropriate for a woman to cover her head, do what is cultural in your culture. If it's appropriate in your culture for a man to have head uncovered, have your head uncovered. And confess on my reading, for me at least, this seems to be essentially appeal to what's going on in Corinth, and kind of playing what we might call a kind of a straight-backed kind of response. Why do I say that? Because I think it seems to be a cultural argument being made, but in recent scholarship we've started to unearth the idea that when the churches met together, they probably didn't meet in houses, or only occasionally met in houses. Houses actually wouldn't be big enough to house a congregation, to house the church. And the suggestion is, particularly in Corinth, that they met outside. And I wonder if Paul is saying is when the church is on show, when the gospel is being proclaimed, in some ways kind of play it. Don't make a rod for your back. Play it safe. It's appropriate for a woman to cover her head, let her cover her head. If it's appropriate for a male not to cover his head, don't cover his head. Particularly if there are other religious places where a woman's head was uncovered. And that was seen as a bit racy, or as a bit problematic. Paul, rightly or wrongly, seems to be saying, just play that Geoffrey Boycott straight back. Sound like Theresa May, aren't I? Quoting Geoffrey Boycott. So I think this first instance I want to appeal to a kind of a cultural argument. It's about Corinth, but actually only about Corinth, at least in the head covering. And I wonder if Paul might raise an eyebrow at the suggestion that his instruction about head coverings was to be extended beyond Corinth. Question?
Yeah.
Just your suggestion is that this piece by Paul should be seen particularly and only as referring to Corinth. But if we go down to verse 16, but if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God, which seems to make some difficulty with that viewpoint.
I think Paul rails back on what he says as it ensues. I think he started thinking on his... I think Paul thinks on his feet in Corinth. But for me that underscores that he's just wanting to be kind of pragmatic and not put a kind of stake in the ground.
Right.
If it just makes sense, do it. Let's not over egg the question. If you go ahead, let's just not make an issue out of it. However, I think it's a bit more complicated than the next part. Verse 7 onwards. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection of God, but woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. Friends, here I think I have a bit more trouble getting Paul off the hook.
Can I say, most men who said like he wasn't for women, so it's not too far off. Women there.
What seems odd that Paul, a good exegetor of the Jewish scriptures, one who knows his Old Testament, his Hebrew Bible very well, is he confusing his Genesis 1 with his Genesis 2? In Genesis 1, it is humanity that's made in the image of God. The human being, the earth creature, as Phyllis Tribble describes it. You can't have male until you have female. You can't have female until you have male. You can't have gender distinction until you've got two. So whereas, at least when I read Genesis 1 and the image of God language that's ascribed to the human being that's non-gendered, Paul seems to read the image and reflection of God in relation to a man, and we don't get man and woman until Genesis 2. So Paul putting his Old Testament essay for me to mark at Queen's, there'd be a bit of a red line saying, I think you're confusing Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So I'm struggling a bit to get him off the hook here. So maybe we'll just kind of move on that one. If Paul can just try and get a lifeline, is that the final sentence where he says, just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. It's almost as if he has a rather long-winded way, or a complicated way about what's come from what, but ending up in a good place. All things come from God, a rather strong and long-winded way of getting there in the first place. The other odd little reference in this passage that I've commentated on is a bit in the middle. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. What is this authority? First, it's not the veil. The veil's kind of gone. The veil's in the previous slide. Secondly, there's no actual word for symbol there. The NRSV and other translators add symbol in, or signs often used. Literally, it is just authority. A woman has authority over her head. A woman has the right to exercise authority of herself. feels quite positive to me. Because of the angels? Our best guess is that it might draw on traditions of what you might call kind of guardian angels. Angels kind of looking out for you, angels who kind of protect you, angels who want kind of the best for you. Quite why Paul goes there at this point in this discussion about head coverings and authority, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it's probably our best guess. It's something about angels looking out for women when they pray. So in sum, I think it still remains kind of a difficult text. I think I get around the head coverings. I can suggest that they're probably just a Corinthian phenomenon. But again, if for Paul, on his batting order, Genesis 1 and 2, I think I struggle to get him off the hook. The other famous or infamous palatable text comes a little bit later on in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 14. For God is a God not of disorder but of peace. Pause. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches. For they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there's anything you desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? A woman should be silent in church. Anyone who claims to be a college or their spiritual powers must acknowledge that what I am writing here is a command of the Lord. Okay, what do you make of that one? Women should be silent in church. How do we get that? How do we get Paul off the hook on that one? Or how do I get Paul off the hook on that one? It's a tough one, isn't it? Again, the commentators try to find various kind of options of resolving this. Some suggest that what Paul is addressing here is, again, a particularity in Corinth. Mainly that there's chitter-chatter going on in a particular corner, and Paul just wants them to shut up, basically, and to let the worship service continue. It's kind of disruptive speech, not speech per se. Some suggest that it's just that some things are not permissible for women. Maybe something to do with the interpretation of prophecy, perhaps, but I can't persuaded by that one. Some have suggested that this only applies to married women, but not to unmarried women. Let's not go there. Some have viewed this as Paul responding to a very vocal group of female prophets in Corinth. And again, there's things that we don't know about that Paul's wanting to address, but we just don't have the data to go there. Or, to my mind, this is the most persuasive answer. This isn't Paul. You may notice the brackets. The brackets have been put around it by the editors. This is the NRSV version, they put brackets around. And so in some textual versions, you'll see it almost separated off in a little section in the middle of the page. This is because we think it's a post-Pauline addition to 1 Corinthians. To my knowledge, we don't have any manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14 without it, but we have it in a number of different places in those manuscripts. So it tends to kind of move about, which may suggest it's not original to Paul. And it's possible, though it is only a guess I know, it's possible that a later scribe or editor has added it into 1 Corinthians because of 1 Timothy 2, that Deutero-Pauline text where Paul said, I don't permit all men to preach. So we think it is a later addition because if it is originally Paul, if it is genuine Paul, he's changed his mind from 3 chapters ago. Whatever our take on the head coverings otherwise, a woman is to pray and prophesy with her head covered. And the expectation is that a woman will pray and prophesy in chapter 11. If this is indeed Paul, and I don't think it is, but if it is indeed Paul, he's changed his mind within 3 chapters in quite a dramatic roundabout turn. So, as an exegete, I think the most likely explanation is it is a later addition to the text. So I think we can get Paul off the hook on this.
It's interesting how the churches have taken up the theme of women being kept under, and until very recent times you were expected to cover your head in church, and until recently women were not allowed to read from the altar. I'm talking about, even in my lifetime those changes have taken place. So the church itself has really cottoned on to these so-called ideas of suppressing women.
And there would be a number of traditions even today who would expect a woman to cover her head in prayer and would appeal to 1 Corinthians 11, or to be silent and appeal to 1 Corinthians 14 in that regard. That's just why I kind of frame our discussion by saying I want to focus on what Paul says rather than the reception of the texts, because they can go in a number of directions, really palatable texts and the less palatable. Let's just pause there for any other kind of comments or questions just from those less palatable ones. You want to come back at me or just offer further thought.
I know you said this is Gentile, but one argument I've heard was in the Jewish synagogue, the women would shout to each other. I mean, there's a question, was it relating to that?
I think that's possible. I think you can always, if you could think of a way of resolving it, or a way of putting the kind of the historical reality behind it, chances are someone has suggested it. I think I found 25 different suggestions of what might be going on in this scenario, and I could bore you with all 25 of them, but just to get a little flavour of the variety of them might be a better place. I think I'm most confident it's not Pauline because of the way it requires him to change his views within 3 chapters.
Thanks, probably not so much a question as a comment, but since there's scriptural proof here of a female apostle and of a female deacon, how on earth did the early church get into the mess? All right, I'll go mess that it's got into with saying only men can be ordained.
I'll take the Fifth Amendment on that one. And it's really, my aim tonight was just to kind of tease out that to address the text rather than exploring the implications of them, because I know those matters are held with some seriousness, but whatever view one takes, those things are not held lightly. I won't think otherwise. I'm off, my friend.
If you look at that text and look at the text in Timothy as well, so they're really quite similar. Isn't it evident that whether Paul wrote it or not, these attitudes were circulating in the early church?
Yes.
And how can we say that they didn't come from Paul?
Well, I think they must be coming from somewhere, and they must reflect something. But I think that puts a lot of burden onto Paul and also to Timothy, and I think actually someone's not persuaded that Paul wrote on Timothy. Sorry. I think it's a generation after, at least. But I think, but equally, I recognise that we must take seriously the fact that 1 Timothy must be brought about by something, and whether one is understanding that text or misunderstanding that text, I think we're seeing a kickback from 1 Timothy into 1 Corinthians. I just don't think 1 Timothy is Paul. I'll share that afterwards if you want.
It just mentions there that as the law also says, so if Paul is very Jewish, he would adhere to the Jewish laws. So does that back it up that in the Jewish...
Well, it depends what we think the law is here. Is it Jewish law? Is it a local law? Is it local guidance? I don't know. It's an ambiguous passage, and the danger is that we build approaches on it or build interpretations on something which is at the very least contested. I think the NRSV doesn't put a capital L there, which it does often do when it's speaking of the Jewish law. And that may reflect that the NRSV translators take a more local touch on the identity of the law here. Should we turn more briefly then to another nice, straightforward question? When you played, you only got 15 more minutes. What did Paul think about same-sex relationships? Friends, I don't think Paul talks very much about them. And we're going to see, actually, he hasn't got much to say. And I might ask not dissimilar questions that we ask in respect of his attitude towards women. How big a question is it for Paul? I'm just not sure it's quite as big an issue as either side of the debate have made of it. How big a question is it? And to what extent is sexual orientation and how we might understand that in a 21st century context? How far is that a legitimate category for Paul, or to expect Paul to be using and applying? Paul's a man of his time. Are we expecting too much from him in this regard? And thus, to what extent is it anachronistic to impose modern conceptions of same-sex sexual relationships onto the Pauline context? It seems that where there is male sexual relationships that are found in the first century, they are unequal. They are exploitative. They are exercises of power. The term that's often used is pederasty. P-E-D-E-R-A-S-T-Y. A probably quite powerful male exploiting a younger male for pleasure or gain or profit in some ways. So from the outset, we're in, I think, a difficult situation of trying to map kind of Pauline discourse to answer the kind of questions that our churches have before us today in terms of same-sex relationships. So hence, I just don't think there's very much to say. There's two passages which are invariably referred to or cited in this regard. First up, Romans 1, 18 to 30. And the second half of chapter 1 of Romans, where Paul seems to launch into an attack on Gentile sin. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to degrading their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed and forever. Amen. I'm going to take a little bit of a pause there. I've added in the ... just that kind of pause mark. As it continues. For this reason, God gave them up to their degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts of men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for the error. A few observations. Firstly, this seems to be an attack on Gentile idolatry. This is Paul saying this is what those baddie Gentile types do. They've abandoned their Creator. They're worshipping idols to human-made images, and God has kind of handed them over to impurity in that regard. So it depends then what we do with the natural or unnatural that comes afterwards. Is Paul here offering a universal principle? Is he making a principle that's drawn from creation? Or is he just using it as an example of lust or of sinfulness? And is he talking about the full extent of same-sex relationships? Or is he talking just about these pederastic type of exploitative same-sex relationships? When he uses language of natural, is that an appeal to creation? Is it an appeal to the creation order, to Genesis 1, God created male and female? And therefore there would be some who would read this text saying Paul is making a creation appeal, and therefore Romans 1 forbids same-sex relationships by appealing to a creation order. Alternatively, others would say it's a different kind of nature. What is natural for you or for the person involved? And that Paul's critique here is those who are of heterosexual nature going against their nature and doing what is unnatural for them, i.e. to pursue same-sex relationships. It's what's unnatural for you rather than a wider appeal to creation. I think you could argue it either way. I think what we have here is a very opaque text, and there's a a huge amount of literature that's just on these two verses. But I confess that my instinct is that the interpretation that the interpreter arrives at is really conditioned about what they want to get from the text, rather than what Paul might have been saying. I think if you want to make a case that Paul forbids same-sex relationships, you can make Romans 1 say that. If you want to make a case that Paul is fairly ambivalent about same-sex relationships and perhaps is merely criticising pederasty, you can make a case for it from Romans 1. It's a fairly small, ambiguous text, but I think you can make it work whichever way you're predisposed to want to make it. So I just have a note of caution about wanting to apply that to our wider discussions within the church at the moment. And if it's the case for Romans 1, I want to make an even stronger case for the other instance in which we find this kind of discourse. And that's in 1 Corinthians 6. Where Paul lets loose on another of his sin lists. Do you not know that the wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, malakoi, arsenokoitai, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. What are the malakoi and the arsenokoitai? I think we can clear that Paul doesn't think very highly of them. They're not doing something which he's particularly approving of, but trying to be clear about what the reference of these two words here is somewhat complex. We don't really know what the words mean. We think we do, but actually we don't. Malakoi. The Greek word malakos means soft. So malakoi would normally be rendered as soft ones. What's that? Soft ones. I mean, you can see where people might want to go with it, but it's quite hard to translate. Soft ones? Arsenokoitai. Again, we're not entirely sure what that might mean. It's made up of two kind of parts. The arson is not arsenal, much as I wish it were, and that's the arsenal. So that's the male part, and the koitai is that's kind of the sexual intercourse where we get kind of post-coital relations. That's where we get into English. So we've got a male and we've got a penetration, sexual penetration in the word. What we're not sure is it the males doing the penetration, or is it the penetration of a male? We're not sure which is the subject, which is the object. And it's quite hard to translate the word. There is a similar term in Leviticus, which does seem to be saying something quite negative about male-male sexual relationship. And for a number of commentators, they would appeal to the Levitical evidence, saying, when Paul's using this term, he's using it in the light of Leviticus, and therefore it is Paul condemning same-sex relationships. Well, there are some variations that will require Paul to know that quite well. I think more telling is the different translations of those two words that recent modern English translations have arrived at. So in RSV, male prostitutes and sodomites. That feels men who practice homosexuality both times. Or quite quite different from the NASB's effeminate and homosexuals. That's one of my kind of interpretive rules of thumb, is that when I see differences in translation, particularly the variety we have here, across so many different translations, I'm a bit reluctant to build too much on it. Because it's hard to see quite what these words mean with any precision. Just to my English ear, those terms were quite different, whether I'm taking the RSV line or the ESV line. And again, I suspect the translations that the translators have used are in some ways influenced by what they would like the words to mean, or what they think they mean, rather than by arriving at a process of some rather expensive lexical work. So friends, take your pick in terms of translation, but I would hope you're attentive to the fact that there's a real variety about what it might mean. And even in some, all we've got in Paul is, at best, 2 passages which appear to be dealing with this. The first of which I think you can cut either way, depending on your view. And the second one here, where we don't really know how to translate the words involved. It's quite clear that Paul doesn't think they're very good, but quite what Paul is critiquing in 1 Corinthians 6, I think it's harder to be clear on. So what does Paul say about same-sex relationships? Not very much. Well, thank you, friends. Thank you for your conversation. Thank you for your participation over the last 4 weeks. Time marches on, and it's been a pleasure to be with you. And best wishes for Advent and wherever you are going to be celebrating that. So thank you for the invitation and your best wishes.